Welcome back to Edgar Cayce Narratives. And if you've been here before, you already know this channel is not about abstract ideas, but about patterns that quietly shape how we experience our lives without always understanding why. Today, I want to talk about a feeling that many people carry for years but rarely explain clearly, because it doesn't fit into simple categories like personality or intelligence. And it often starts so early that it feels like it has always been there. Have you ever felt older than your actual age, even when you were still a child? Not just more mature or more responsible, but like your perspective didn't match the people around you, and you were somehow looking at life from a different place without knowing how you got there. If that question feels familiar, then this story is not just something you will listen to. It is something you may recognize in yourself as we go deeper into it. So let's begin with a very simple moment that many people overlook, but that often says more than it seems at first. It often begins in a moment that looks completely normal from the outside, something simple that no one would pay attention to unless they were the one experiencing it. A child sits quietly while others are playing, not excluded, not ignored, and not unable to join, but simply choosing not to. Because something about the way the others are acting does not fully connect with how they feel inside. They are present, they are aware, and they understand what is happening around them. But there is a subtle distance that is hard to explain even at that age. This child is not shy in the usual sense, because when spoken to, they can respond clearly and comfortably, and they are not afraid of interaction or attention. They are also not withdrawn in a way that suggests sadness or isolation, because they are not suffering from being alone in that moment. Instead, what defines the experience is a quiet sense of observation, as if they are watching rather than participating, taking in details, behaviors, and emotions without fully stepping into them. It is not a rejection of others, but it is also not a natural alignment with them. Very early on, there is an awareness that something feels different, even if there are no words to describe it yet. And this awareness does not come from comparison or judgment, but from a subtle internal recognition. The child notices that the things that excite others do not create the same reaction in them, and the conversations or games that seem engaging to everyone else feel repetitive or uninteresting in a way that is difficult to explain without sounding dismissive. They are not trying to be different, and they are not trying to stand apart. But the difference is there whether they choose it or not. In some moments, they may try to join in, to follow what others are doing, and to respond in ways that seem expected. But the experience often feels slightly forced, as if they are learning a pattern rather than naturally expressing it. There is a sense of performing normal behavior rather than fully living it. And even when they succeed in blending in, something inside still feels out of place. This creates a quiet confusion, because nothing is clearly wrong, yet nothing feels completely right either. As time goes on, this feeling does not disappear, and instead, it becomes more noticeable in small, everyday situations where the gap between inner experience and outer behavior becomes clearer. The child may find themselves thinking about things that others their age do not usually consider, such as consequences, meaning, or the emotional layers behind simple actions. And this kind of thinking does not come from being taught, but seems to arise naturally. It is not about knowing more, but about seeing differently. And that difference begins to shape how they relate to everything around them. There is also a growing sense that they do not fully belong to the rhythm of their environment, even when everything appears normal on the surface. And this does not come with strong emotion or resistance, but with a quiet, steady recognition. They may not feel lonely in the traditional sense, but they do feel separate in a way that is difficult to share with others, because there is no clear event or reason that explains it. It is simply a feeling that has been there for as long as they can remember, At this stage, there is no clear conclusion, no label, and no explanation. Only a simple but persistent realization that continues to return in different forms as they grow older. I wasn't like them, but I didn't know what I was instead. And that question does not create panic or urgency, but it stays in the background, quietly shaping how they experience the world without ever fully announcing itself. As the child grows older, what once felt like a small difference in certain moments begins to show up more consistently across different areas of life, and it becomes harder to ignore because it no longer depends on a specific situation. In school, conversations with peers often feel limited, not because others lack intelligence, but because the topics and the way they are discussed do not fully engage the same level of attention or interest. The person can participate, respond, and even appear involved, but internally, there is a sense that something is missing, as if the interaction stays on the surface without reaching a deeper level that they naturally look for. This pattern does not stay confined to school, because it follows them into social settings where they are expected to connect, share, and build friendships in ways that feel natural to everyone else. They may have friends, they may be included, and they may even be liked. But there is often a quiet distance that remains, not created by conflict or rejection, but by a difference in how connection is experienced. Small talk feels repetitive. Group dynamics feel predictable, and emotional reactions from others sometimes seem exaggerated or difficult to relate to, even when they try to understand them. Over time, they begin to notice that they feel more comfortable in the presence of people who are older than them, not because they are trying to grow up faster, but because the conversations and perspectives feel closer to what they already experience internally. With older individuals, there is often a sense of ease, as if less translation is needed between what is said and what is meant. And this creates a kind of alignment that is rarely found with people their own age. This preference is not always intentional, but it becomes clear through repeated experience that certain environments feel more natural than others. At the same time, solitude becomes less of a temporary state and more of a consistent preference, not driven by avoidance but by a sense of clarity that is easier to maintain when alone. Being by themselves does not feel empty or lacking, because their internal world is active, reflective, and often more engaging than the external environment. They think, they observe, and they process experiences in a way that does not require constant interaction. And this reinforces the idea that they are not missing something essential by being alone, even if others assume that they are. What makes this pattern more complex is that it repeats across different stages of life, even as circumstances change and new environments are introduced. A new school, a new group of people, or even a new phase of life does not reset the experience, because the same sense of difference returns in slightly different forms. At first, there may be an expectation that things will feel different in a new setting, but over time it becomes clear that the pattern is not tied to a specific place or group, but to something more internal and consistent. There is also a growing awareness that this is not simply a phase that will pass with time, because it has already moved through multiple stages without changing its core feeling. The person may question themselves, wondering if they are overthinking, if they are too serious, or if they are somehow limiting their own ability to connect. But these explanations do not fully account for the experience. Even when they try to adjust, to be more like others, or to engage in the same way, the underlying difference remains, quiet but persistent. Eventually, the realization becomes harder to avoid, not because it is dramatic, but because it is consistent, and consistency is difficult to dismiss. This is not something that appears once and disappears, but something that follows them through time, showing up in conversations, relationships, choices, and reactions in ways that are subtle but unmistakable. It does not demand attention, but it does not leave either. And that is what makes it significant. At some point, the question shifts from, why does this happen sometimes? To why does this keep happening no matter where I am or who I am with? And that shift marks the beginning of a deeper awareness that this experience is not random, not situational, and not temporary. It is a pattern, and like any pattern, it suggests that there is something underneath it that has not yet been fully understood. As this pattern becomes clearer, the tension does not come from the outside world, but from the growing gap between how they are seen and how they actually experience themselves. And this gap becomes harder to ignore over time. On the surface, everything still appears normal because they are the same age as everyone around them. They go through the same stages, and they are expected to respond in similar ways. But internally, the experience feels different in a way that does not match those expectations. This creates a quiet pressure to align outwardly while feeling misaligned inwardly, and that pressure builds slowly without a clear point where it begins. They know they are young, and they understand what that is supposed to mean, but they do not feel it in the way others seem to. And that difference is difficult to explain without sounding unclear or exaggerated. It is not about wanting to grow up faster or rejecting youth, because there is no active desire to escape their age. But there is a persistent sense that their perspective does not belong to the stage they are in. They may look at situations, relationships, and decisions with a level of seriousness or distance that feels natural to them but unusual to others. And this creates moments where their reactions seem out of place, even when they are completely genuine. At times, they try to adjust, to respond more like others, to match the tone of the group, and to participate in ways that feel expected. But this effort often feels like a form of translation rather than expression. They are not expressing what comes naturally, but shaping their response to fit a pattern that does not fully match their internal state. And while this can work temporarily, it creates a subtle sense of disconnect that does not go away. Over time, this leads to a kind of dual experience where one part of them is engaged in the moment, while another part remains slightly separate, observing and processing at a different depth. This tension becomes more noticeable in emotional situations, where others react quickly, strongly, or impulsively, while they tend to pause, reflect, and respond with a level of control that feels automatic rather than learned. It is not that they do not feel emotions, because they often feel them deeply, but the way those emotions are processed creates a delay or a distance that others may interpret as detachment. This difference can make it harder to relate in moments where shared emotional reactions are expected, and it can lead to misunderstandings that are difficult to correct because the underlying experience is not visible. There are also moments when the thought becomes more direct, not fully formed but clear enough to be noticed, and it usually appears in a simple but unsettling way. I feel like I have already lived through something, but I cannot explain what it is, and I do not remember it in any clear or concrete way. This is not a belief or a conclusion, but a feeling that comes and goes, often triggered by situations that seem familiar on a deeper level than they should be. It does not provide answers, but it raises a question that stays in the background even when it is not actively considered. As this continues, the tension is no longer just about difference but about explanation, because there is still no clear reason that accounts for what they are experiencing. They may look for answers in personality, intelligence, upbringing, or environment, but none of these fully explain why the feeling has been so consistent across time and situations. Each explanation seems to describe part of the experience, but not all of it. And this creates a sense that something important is missing from the way they understand themselves. This leads to a quiet but persistent uncertainty, not about who they are in a general sense, but about why they experience life in this particular way. And that uncertainty does not resolve easily because it is tied to something that has no clear starting point. It has always been there, and because of that, it feels both familiar and unresolved at the same time, like a question that has been present for years without ever being fully asked. At this stage, the tension reaches a point where it can no longer be ignored, not because it becomes overwhelming, but because it becomes consistent enough to demand attention in a more direct way. They are young, but they do not feel young, and that simple contradiction carries more weight than it seems, because it points to a deeper layer of experience that has not yet been clearly understood. As this experience continues over time, it begins to take shape through consistent traits that are easy to observe but difficult to fully explain, because they do not come from a single cause or event. One of the first things that becomes noticeable is a kind of early seriousness, not in a heavy or negative sense, but in the way they approach situations with a level of attention that goes beyond what is expected for their age. They do not treat things lightly by default, and even in simple situations, there is a tendency to consider meaning, consequence, and context in a way that feels automatic rather than learned. This seriousness does not mean they cannot enjoy moments or participate in normal activities, but the way they experience those moments is often different, because there is always a layer of awareness running in the background. While others may fully immerse themselves in play or distraction, they tend to remain slightly aware of what is happening beneath the surface, noticing patterns in behavior, shifts in emotion, and unspoken dynamics that are not immediately obvious. This does not make them distant, but it does create a different relationship with the moment, where enjoyment is often balanced with observation. Another clear trait is deep thinking that appears early without being forced, as if the mind naturally moves toward questions that go beyond immediate situations. They may find themselves reflecting on topics like purpose, cause, and effect, or the reasons behind people's actions at an age when most others are focused on more immediate concerns. This is not something they are taught directly, and it does not come from trying to appear intelligent, but from a natural inclination to look further into things rather than accept them at face value. This kind of thinking often leads to a heightened awareness of consequences, where decisions are not made impulsively but considered in terms of their longer-term effects, even in situations that seem small or insignificant. While others may act quickly and adjust later, they tend to pause, evaluate, and choose with a level of caution that feels unusual for their stage of life. This does not come from fear, but from a sense that actions carry weight, even when that weight is not immediately visible. At the same time, there is often a discomfort with typical social patterns that are based on repetition, surface-level interaction, or unspoken rules that do not feel meaningful. Group behaviors that rely on conformity, exaggerated reactions, or shifting social dynamics can feel tiring or difficult to engage with over long periods. Not because they are misunderstood, but because they do not align with how the person naturally processes interaction. They can follow these patterns when needed, but doing so often feels like adapting rather than expressing something genuine. Because of this, there is usually a clear preference for more meaningful interaction, even if it happens less frequently, where conversations move beyond routine topics and allow for depth, reflection, and honest exchange. These moments feel more natural and more aligned with how they experience the world, and they often leave a stronger impression than a larger number of lighter interactions. It is not about avoiding people, but about seeking a level of connection that feels real rather than automatic. It is important to understand that these traits do not come from a single defining experience, such as trauma or a specific event that forced early maturity, because in many cases, there is no clear external reason that explains why these patterns developed. The person may have had a normal environment, supportive relationships, and typical opportunities, yet the way they perceive and process life still follows a different path. This makes it harder to explain using standard frameworks, because the cause does not appear in a way that can be easily identified. Over time, these traits become stable rather than temporary, and they begin to form a consistent way of interacting with the world that does not depend on changing circumstances. The seriousness, the depth of thought, the awareness of consequences, and the preference for meaningful interaction all continue to appear in different situations, reinforcing the sense that this is not something that will simply fade or adjust on its own. It becomes part of how they move through life, shaping their choices, their relationships, and the way they understand themselves. As these patterns settle into place, the question is no longer whether they are real, but what they actually mean, because the traits themselves are clear, but their origin and purpose are still not. They describe the experience, but they do not explain it. And that leaves space for a different kind of interpretation that goes beyond personality or development alone. At this point, the pattern is clear, the traits are consistent, and the tension has already been felt over time. But the question still remains open, because nothing fully explains why this experience exists in the first place. Personality can describe parts of it, development can explain certain aspects, and environment can shape how it shows up. But none of these alone account for the full picture, especially when the feeling has been present from such an early stage without a clear external cause. This is where a different kind of perspective becomes useful, not as a final answer, but as another way to look at what is already there. Edgar Cayce approached experiences like this from a different angle, one that does not focus only on the current lifetime, but considers the possibility that what we experience now may carry traces of something that existed before. In his readings, he often described individuals as bringing forward accumulated experience, not in the form of specific memories or factual knowledge, but in the way they perceive, interpret, and respond to life. This idea shifts the focus away from what a person knows and toward how they naturally see and process the world around them. From this perspective, the feeling of being older than one's age is not about having more information or being more advanced in a measurable way, but about having a kind of familiarity with life that does not need to be learned from the beginning. It is as if certain patterns, reactions, and understandings are already in place, not because they were taught early, but because they were carried forward in a way that influences perception from the start. This does not mean the person remembers anything directly, but it suggests that the way they experience life is shaped by something that feels already known on a deeper level. This helps explain why the difference appears so early and remains consistent over time, because it is not something that develops gradually through experience in the current life alone. Instead, it shows up as a starting point, a baseline way of seeing things that is already present before most learning takes place. The child who observes more than participates, who reflects more than reacts, and who feels slightly out of sync without knowing why, may not be developing these traits step by step, but expressing something that was already there in a less visible form. Cayce's perspective also makes an important distinction between knowledge and perspective, because knowledge can be taught, measured, and compared, while perspective is something more subtle that shapes how knowledge is used and understood. A person may not know more facts than others, may not perform differently in obvious ways, and may not appear exceptional in traditional terms. but the way they interpret situations, relationships, and choices reflects a depth that does not match their age. This difference is not always visible from the outside, but it is very clear from within. Seen this way, the sense of familiarity with life is not random, and it is not simply a personality trait, but part of a larger continuity that extends beyond a single timeline. The feeling of "I have been here before" is not taken as a literal memory of specific events, but as an indication that the structure of experience itself feels known, even when the details are new. Situations may be different, people may change, and circumstances may vary, but the underlying patterns feel recognizable in a way that is difficult to explain using only present life experience. This perspective does not require belief, and it does not ask for acceptance as a fixed truth, because its value lies in how it reframes the experience rather than in proving something beyond doubt. It offers a way to look at the same pattern without reducing it to a problem or forcing it into explanations that only partially fit. Instead of asking what is wrong with this difference, it shifts the question toward what kind of experience would make this perspective feel natural from the beginning. When seen through this lens, the person who feels older than their age is not ahead in a competitive sense, and not separate in a way that needs to be corrected, but aligned with a different starting point that shapes how life is experienced from the very beginning. The difference is not something added over time, but something expressed over time, and that changes how the entire pattern can be understood. From here, the experience begins to take on a different meaning, not as something to fix or explain away, but as something to recognize and explore more carefully, because the pattern itself may be pointing to a deeper continuity that has always been present, even if it has not yet been clearly understood. At this stage, it becomes important to step back from a single personal story and look at how often this pattern appears across different people, because what feels individual at first begins to show signs of being more widely shared. Many people describe a similar sense of being out of sync from a young age, where they were able to function normally on the surface but internally experienced life with a different level of depth or distance that they could not explain at the time. These accounts come from different backgrounds, different environments, and different life paths, yet the core feeling remains surprisingly consistent. In some cases, this experience is compared to what is often described as giftedness, where a child shows advanced thinking, strong awareness, or early intellectual development, and there are moments where the two can overlap. A person who thinks deeply, reflects early, and processes information in complex ways may appear similar to someone who is simply more cognitively advanced, and this can lead to the assumption that the experience is fully explained by intelligence alone. However, when looked at more closely, there are clear differences that begin to separate these two patterns. Intelligence tends to show itself in measurable ways, such as learning speed, problem-solving ability, or academic performance, and it often becomes visible through external results that can be observed and compared. The experience we are describing does not always follow that path, because a person can feel deeply out of sync with their age while still performing in completely average ways in structured environments. They may not stand out in school, they may not pursue advanced paths, and they may not even identify themselves as particularly intelligent. Yet the internal sense of difference remains just as strong. What defines this pattern is not how much a person knows, but how familiar life itself feels. And that familiarity appears in subtle ways that are not easily measured or categorized. It shows up in how quickly certain situations are understood, how naturally consequences are considered, and how instinctively deeper layers of meaning are recognized without needing to be explained. This creates a form of recognition that does not rely on learning something new, but on encountering something that already feels known in a less direct way. There are also many individuals who describe this experience without ever connecting it to any specific label, because it does not fit neatly into existing categories, and it often exists alongside completely ordinary life circumstances. They go through the same stages, follow similar paths, and meet similar expectations, but carry an internal perspective that quietly shapes how they experience everything. When these individuals speak about it, the language may differ, but the underlying pattern remains the same. And that consistency suggests that this is not an isolated phenomenon. At the same time, it is important not to turn this into a defining identity, or something that separates one person from others in a rigid way, because the pattern itself does not imply superiority or difference in value. It simply reflects a variation in how experience is processed and understood. And that variation can exist alongside many other ways of engaging with life. Some people move through life by exploring, reacting, and learning step by step, while others seem to begin with a certain level of familiarity that changes how those steps are experienced. When these patterns are placed side by side, it becomes clear that what we are looking at is not a rare exception, but a recognizable variation within human experience. One that has been described in different ways across time, but rarely explained in a way that fully captures its depth. This realization shifts the focus away from "why am I like this?" toward a broader understanding that this experience appears in many forms and across many lives. Even if it is not always openly discussed, this expansion does not remove the personal aspect of the experience, but it places it within a larger context where it can be seen more clearly, not as something isolated or unusual in a negative sense, but as part of a pattern that repeats across different individuals who share a similar way of perceiving life. Once this is recognized, the question changes again, moving from isolation toward understanding, and opening the possibility that what feels deeply personal may also be part of something more widely shared. To understand this experience more clearly, it helps to look at how modern psychology approaches similar patterns, not to replace the earlier perspective, but to ground it in mechanisms that can be observed and studied within a single lifetime. From this angle, some individuals develop a higher level of cognitive awareness earlier than others, meaning they are able to process information, recognize patterns, and reflect on experiences in ways that go beyond what is typical for their age group. This does not always result in visible achievement, but it does shape how they interpret situations and respond to them internally. One important factor is the way the brain handles pattern recognition, because some people naturally pick up on connections, emotional signals, and behavioral tendencies more quickly and more consistently than others. This leads to a deeper understanding of situations without needing repeated exposure, and it creates a sense that certain dynamics are already familiar even when they are being encountered for the first time. The mind is not recalling a specific memory, but it is recognizing a structure, and that recognition can feel similar to having experienced something before. Emotional sensitivity also plays a role, particularly in how individuals perceive and process the emotional states of others, because a higher level of sensitivity can lead to a more complex internal response even in simple interactions. Instead of reacting only to what is visible, they may pick up on subtle cues, unspoken tension, or underlying motivations, and this creates a layered experience that goes beyond the surface of the situation. Over time, this can contribute to a feeling of distance because the person is engaging with more information than what is being openly expressed. Another aspect is the development of internal reflection, where a person spends more time analyzing their own thoughts, reactions, and decisions, often without being prompted to do so. This reflective process can begin early and continue consistently, leading to a stronger sense of internal continuity that makes each experience feel connected to previous ones. As a result, life does not feel like a series of separate events, but like an ongoing process that builds on itself. And this continuity can create the impression of having moved through more than one stage of experience already. At the same time, there is often a difference in how social interaction is processed, because individuals who focus more on depth than on immediate engagement may find it harder to align with group dynamics that rely on quick responses and shared emotional rhythms. This does not mean they lack social ability, but that their processing style prioritizes understanding over participation. And this can create a mismatch in environments where speed and spontaneity are more valued. Over time, this reinforces the sense of being out of sync, even when there is no clear barrier to connection. It is also important to consider that early maturity can develop without a single defining cause, because a combination of temperament, environment, and natural cognitive tendencies can produce a similar outcome without needing a specific triggering event. A person may grow up in a stable and supportive setting, yet still develop a level of awareness and reflection that sets them apart from their peers. And this challenges the idea that early depth must always come from difficulty or pressure. When these psychological factors are combined, they create a framework that can explain many aspects of the experience in practical terms, showing how certain traits can lead to a deeper and more complex way of engaging with life from an early age. However, even with this explanation, there are still elements that remain difficult to fully account for, especially the strong sense of familiarity and the consistency of the pattern across time and context. This is where the psychological view and the earlier perspective begin to meet, not as opposing explanations, but as different ways of describing the same underlying experience, one focusing on observable mechanisms and the other on continuity beyond a single lifetime. Together, they provide a more complete picture, allowing the experience to be understood both as a natural variation in development and as something that may extend beyond what is immediately visible. At this point, after looking at the pattern from both a personal and a broader perspective, the question is no longer whether this experience is real, but what it actually means in a clear and practical way. The first thing that becomes important to understand is that age, as we usually define it, does not always match the way experience is felt internally, because age measures time, but it does not fully capture how that time is processed or understood. A person can move through the same number of years as everyone else, but carry a different sense of familiarity with life that changes how each moment is experienced. This leads to a simple but important shift in how the experience is interpreted, because instead of seeing it as being ahead, behind, or out of place, it can be seen as a difference in starting point. Some people build their understanding step by step through new experiences, while others seem to begin with a certain level of familiarity that makes those steps feel less new and more like something they are returning to. This does not place one above the other, and it does not suggest a hierarchy, but it does explain why the same situation can feel completely different depending on how it is internally received. The idea of being an old soul is often used to describe this experience, but it can sometimes create confusion because it sounds like a label rather than an explanation, and it can imply something fixed or defined when the experience itself is more fluid. A more accurate way to understand it is not as a label, but as a description of perspective, where the person is not carrying more value or importance, but a different kind of familiarity with life that shapes how they see and respond to it. This keeps the focus on experience rather than identity, which makes the idea easier to understand without turning it into something rigid. It is also important to recognize that this difference is not a problem that needs to be corrected, even if it sometimes creates moments of distance or misunderstanding, because the experience itself is not an error in development or a sign that something went wrong. It is simply a variation in how life is processed, and like any variation, it comes with both advantages and challenges that need to be understood rather than fixed. Trying to force alignment with a pattern that does not feel natural may reduce the visible difference, but it does not resolve the underlying experience. When seen clearly, the pattern begins to make more sense, because the consistency that once felt confusing now becomes a form of clarity, showing that the experience has a stable structure rather than being random or inconsistent. The feeling of being older than one's age is not about time moving differently, but about perspective being shaped in a way that makes life feel more familiar from the beginning. This shifts the entire interpretation from confusion to recognition, where the focus is no longer on explaining the difference away, but on understanding what it reflects. In simple terms, you are not ahead of life, and you are not out of place within it, but you are experiencing it from a perspective that carries a sense of familiarity that others may develop later or in a different way. This does not change what you go through, but it changes how you move through it, and that difference is what has been present from the very beginning. Once this is understood, the experience no longer needs to be questioned in the same way, because it has a context that allows it to be seen more clearly. At this point, it is worth turning the focus away from explanation and toward your own experience, because what matters most is not how the idea is described, but how it connects to something you have already felt in your own life. Think back to the earliest moment you can remember when you felt slightly out of place, not in a dramatic way, but in a quiet and consistent way that did not need a clear reason to exist. It may have been a small moment, something that did not seem important at the time, but when you look at it now, it carries a different meaning, because you can see how it connects to everything that came after. As you moved through different stages of life, notice how often that same feeling returned, even when the environment changed and the people around you were completely different. The details may have shifted, but the underlying experience likely remained similar, showing up in conversations, decisions, and reactions in ways that were subtle but consistent. This is not about identifying a single event, but about recognizing a pattern that has been present across time, even if it was never clearly defined. Now consider how you have interpreted that experience up to this point, because many people try to explain it in ways that only partially fit, whether by adjusting their behavior, questioning their own reactions, or assuming that something needs to change in order to feel more aligned. These interpretations are understandable, but they often focus on correcting the experience rather than understanding it, and that can keep the pattern unclear even when it has been present for years. Instead of asking how to change it, try asking a different question that shifts the focus toward recognition rather than adjustment, and notice how that changes the way you look at your own experience. If you have always felt older than your age, not in terms of time but in the way you see and process life, then what does that suggest about where that perspective comes from, and why it has been there from the beginning without needing to be learned step by step? This is not a question that requires an immediate answer, and it is not something that needs to be resolved in a single moment, because its purpose is not to conclude, but to open a different way of looking at something that may have always been part of your life. If that feeling has been consistent, then it may be pointing to something that is also consistent, something that has been shaping your experience quietly over time without needing to be fully explained. So the question remains, simple but difficult to ignore once it is clearly seen, and it is one you can return to whenever the pattern appears again in your life. If you have always felt older than your age, then what have you already experienced before this life? Not as a memory you can recall directly, but as a perspective that continues to shape how you see everything now. If this story felt familiar to you in any way, I'd like you to take a moment and notice which part connected the most, because that usually says more than the whole explanation. You don't need to describe everything, but if you can, share one moment in your life when you clearly felt this difference, even if it was something small that stayed with you longer than expected. If you're still unsure about parts of this experience, or if something in this video didn't fully make sense yet, leave a comment with what you're questioning, because many of these patterns only become clear when we look at them from different angles over time. And if there's a specific topic you want me to explore next, especially something that feels personal but hard to explain, let me know, because that's exactly what this channel is built around. If this video helped you see your experience in a clearer way, don't forget to like and subscribe to Edgar Cayce Narratives, so you don't miss the next story that might connect in a way you didn't expect.